McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 5, Chapter 21, The Modern World. Chapter outline: Romanticism, Realism, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism and Art Nouveau, Bridging the Atlantic, the Americas in the 19th century, into the 20th century, the avant-garde, World War I and after, Dada and Surrealism, Between the Wars, Building New Societies. Romanticism. The art of Romanticism turns away from reason and explores emotion, intuition, individual experience, and imagination. Neoclassical artists held the view that great art could be made only from great subject matter, and that the greatest subject matter of all was history, a category that included classical mythology and biblical scenes. This viewpoint, and the highly polished style that went with it, became enshrined as academic art, the art that was encouraged by official art institutions and exhibitions in the 19th century. Along with neoclassicism, the second dominant trend of the early 19th century, Romanticism, also held its roots in a preceding century. Romanticism was not a style so much as a set of attitudes and characteristic subjects. The 18th century is sometimes known as the Age of Reason, for its leading thinkers placed their faith in rationality, skeptical questioning, and scientific inquiry. Rebelling against those, Romanticism urged the claims of emotion, intuition, individual expression, and above all, imagination, as seen here in Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, a painting which highlights the turmoil of violent uprising and also the results of victory as well as tragic sacrifice. Example 2. Francisco de Goya's Executions of the 3rd of May. Picturesque ruins and the mysterious or awe-inspiring landscapes were also popular among Romantic artists and their patrons. English painter Joseph Mallard William Turner captured wild, dangerous nature in the Valley of Astosia, snowstorm, avalanche, and thunderstorm. Uncontrollable forces batter a valley town in the Italian Alps, the village's church steeples barely visible through the snow and rain. Survivors drag themselves to safety to the painting's right side, but the focus is nature, sheets of rain and powerful avalanches hurling into the valley carrying snow, ice, and rocks. Turner used paint applied in thick, blended brushstrokes to evoke terrifying wildness. Like Goya's tragic painting of the Spaniards executed by French soldiers, Turner's landscape is not interested in beauty. It instead evokes a profound emotional response from viewers who feel terror and awe while gazing into nature's unstoppable power. Romanticism also delighted in scenes of distant cultures that were different from those in Europe. Eugène Delacroix, the leading painter of the Romantic movement in France, spent several months in North Africa in 1832. Fascinated by all that he saw, he filled sketchbooks with drawings, watercolors, and observations. Later, he drew upon that material to create paintings like The Women of Algiers, which portrayed 3 women and their servant in a harem, the most private quarters of an Islamic palace. Delacroix had apparently been allowed to visit an actual harem, a rare privilege for a man, not to mention a European. Compared with neoclassicism's precise drawing, solid composition, and clear colors, Delacroix's technique is freer and more painterly. Forms are built up with fully loaded brushstrokes, contours are blurred, and colors are broken. Romanticism also delighted in scenes of distant cultures that were different from those in Europe. Eugène Delacroix, the leading painter of the Romantic movement in France, spent several months in North Africa in 1832. Fascinated by all that he saw, he filled sketchbooks with drawings, watercolors, and observations. Later, he drew upon that material to create paintings like The Women of Algiers, which portrayed 3 women and their servant in a harem, the most private quarters of an Islamic palace. Delacroix had apparently been allowed to visit an actual harem, a rare privilege for a man, not to mention a European. Compared with neoclassicism's precise drawing, solid composition, and clear colors, Delacroix's technique is freer and more painterly. Forms are built up with fully loaded brush strokes, and contours are blurred, and colors are often broken. Romanticism. Romantic art frequently has a painterly appearance, with thick, unblended brushstrokes, unlike the polished finish of neoclassicism. Example 1, Turner's painting Valley of Astosa Snowstorm, which uses thick paint and unblended brushstrokes. Example 2, Delacroix's painting The Women of Algiers. Realism. Realism depicts the everyday and the ordinary, especially in the lives of the middle and lower classes. The first art movement to be born in the 19th century, realism, was a reaction against both neoclassicism and romanticism. Realist artists depict the everyday life and the ordinary rather than the heroic, the historic, the awe-inspiring, or the exotic. Their works unmasked for art viewers the true lives of the middle class and the lower classes. Taking advantage of lithography's rapid production, French artist Demire illustrated the realities of modern life in newspapers and print portfolios. Demire's most poignant image of the difficult lives faced by France's poor is Rue Transnistienne. The lithograph pictures a family lying dead in their apartment. The father draws our attention. Demire made him the focal point within the composition by placing him centrally and having light fall across his body. The lighting and pose resemble images of Jesus Christ being taken down from the cross. Demire associated the Father with Christ to help us understand the tragic circumstance of his death. A rebellion raged in Paris in April 1834 when the government, led by a new king, imposed strict regulations. As the French military faced the uprising, gunfire rained down on them. The soldiers entered a nearby apartment building and killed the occupants inside, regardless of their guilt or innocence. Parisians were outraged by the indiscriminate killing. Demire's image of a humble family's slaughter was a scathing indictment of the king. Although government censors confiscated the lithographic stone and the copies of the print, Rue Transnistienne embodies realism's truthfulness and unflinching social conscience. Demire's most poignant image of the difficult lives faced by France's poor was Rue Transnistienne. The lithograph pictures a family lying dead in their apartment. The father draws our attention. Demire made him the focal point within the composition by placing him centrally and having the light fall across his body. The lighting and the pose resemble images of Jesus Christ being taken down from the cross. Another representative of the realist cause was the painter Gustave Courbet. He had grown up in Ornans, a small town in the eastern France. He came to Paris at the age of 20, and, in a sense, he brought his town with him. The people he knew there, the lives they led, and the landscape of its region were the subject of his art. In 1849, after one of his paintings was awarded a gold medal at the Salon, the annual state-sponsored exhibition of new art, Courbet returned home and worked through the winter on his first monumental painting. The subject is a graveside funeral of whom we do not know. Courbet used the event as a pretext for a group portrait of townspeople. A priest, two red-robed beadles or lay officials in the church, the mayor, a judge, male mourners, and a gravedigger have gathered around an open grave. The coffin is shown arriving at the left, mirrored by female mourners clustering to the right. A raised crucifix stands outside a dull sky and a distant chalked cliff. Realism. Realistic art is characterized by unidealized truthfulness, unflinching social consciousness. Demire wanted to associate the Father with Christ in this image to help us better understand the tragic circumstances of the family's death. A rebellion raged in Paris in April 1834 when the government, led by a new king, imposed strict regulations. As the French military faced the uprising, gunfire rained down on them. The soldiers entered a nearby apartment building and killed the occupants inside. Regardless of their guilt or innocence, Parisians were outraged by the indiscriminate killing. Demire's image of a humble family slaughter was a scathing indictment of the king. Although government censors confiscated the lithographic stone and the copies of the print, this print embodies realism's truthfulness and unflinching social conscience. When Courbet's painting was shown at the Salon of 1850, a critic later recalled, "It was as though a tornado had blown through the room." Admirers held that this was realism's first masterpiece, while detractors thought Courbet had pushed what they called the cult of the ugly about as far as it could go. The painting offended them on 2 counts. First was its resolute refusal to beautify or sentimentalize the scene. The work uses drab colors and unidealized figures. The second was its scale. Monumental formats were traditionally reserved for historical paintings full of important personages. This painting was full of unknown individuals, taken as important people, reflecting Courbet's liberal politics and ideas. Impressionism. Impressionist art represented scenes of the modern world, leisure, entertainment, and nature, inspired by Japanese prints. This work by Claude Monet, entitled Impressionist Sunrise, was part of an exhibit of artists, painters, sculptors, and printmakers. Upon seeing the exhibition, critic Antoine Castanery used the title of his article to explain what the artist had in common. They were not aiming for perfection, he wrote, but to capture an impression. They did not want to portray a landscape, but the sensation of a landscape. All in all, he was quite taken with them. I swear there's talent here, and a lot of it. These young people have a way of understanding nature that is neither dull nor banal. It's lively, nimble, light, and ravishing. It's admittedly sketchy, but how much of it rings true? He titled his review The Impressionist. The name stuck in the public imagination, and the artists themselves largely accepted it. While capturing the fleeting effect of light was common in Impressionist art, Morisot's Summer Day reveals another of the movement's interest, leisure. In this painting, 2 fashionably dressed young women are boating in a park. One gazes out of the painting with the sky-blue parasol folded up in her lap. The other turns to look at the ducklings swimming alongside. The palette is light and the brushwork is varied and free. The water and the women's dresses show the rapid, sketchy brushwork characteristic of Impressionism. These areas challenge us to see them as more than paint on canvas, seeming to disintegrate the blotches of paint when they are seen up close. Not only to be reconstituted as dresses or water when we step back, the artist reminds us that this painting is not a window into the world, as a sympathetic critic of the day wrote. No one represents Impressionism with a more refined talent or with more authority than Madame Morisot. Picturing a port on a Sunday outing at a park, Monet and Morisot represent modern life, inspired like many of their fellow painters by Japanese print. Gustave Caillebotte also echoed Edo period woodblock prints when he went out into the city of Paris streets on a rainy day. Although he painted with a more academic, polished technique than Monet or Morisot, Caillebotte nevertheless captured a moment. The wet cobblestones reflecting the hazy light of the misty day. There is nothing happening here except the men and the women walking through the rain. At the same time, the painting seems meticulously planned, asymmetrically balanced, with 3 large figures on the right, architecture and empty streets to the left. Shapes and colors repeat throughout the image, and the perspective is mathematically precise. Caillebotte's Impressionist moment may have been fleeting, but the space it inhabits is stable. Impressionism. Impressionist art captures the fleeting effects of light on color with sketchy brushstrokes, dabs, and flicks of paint, sometimes completed outdoors. This painting, entitled Impression Sunrise, painted in 1872 by Claude Monet, was featured in an exhibit, an artist-run exhibit, entitled Anonymous Society of Artists, Painters, Sculptors, and Printmakers, etc. The exhibit was attended by art critic Antoine Castanery, who used the title of his article to explain what all the artists had in common. They were not aiming for perfection, he wrote, but to capture an impression. They did not want to portray a landscape, but the sensation of a landscape. All in all, he was quite taken with them. I swear there's talent here, and a lot of it. These young people have a way of understanding nature that is neither dull nor banal. It's lively, nimble, light, ravishing. It's admittedly sketchy, but how much of it rings true? He titled his review The Impressionist. The name stuck in the public imagination, and the artists themselves largely accepted it. The light we see in Monet's painting is a light we have not seen before in art. Traditional chiaroscuro required a steady and even source of light for modeling the form. But light in nature is not still. It moves and it dances. In Monet's painting, little dabs and flicks of paint indicate the reflections of boats and mast, while small dashes of orange and red capture the sunlight on the water's surface. The boats in the harbor and the factories and the equipment on the shore are suggested by sketchy brushstrokes that evoke shapes but do not describe the surface or the textures. It is as if we are seeing this scene through the rippled surface of the water. Example 2, Summer's Day, painted in 1879. Post-Impressionism and Art Nouveau. Post-Impressionist artists pictured the world in highly personalized styles, unrestricted by academic approaches. The next generation of painters admired many aspects of Impressionism, especially its brightened palette and direct painting technique, but they reacted in different ways to what they perceived as its shortcomings. Their styles are highly personal, and what we commonly group them together under is a neutral term called post-impressionist, meaning simply the artist who came after Impressionism. They include George Seurat, Vincent van Gogh, and Paul Cézanne. The style and technique of Van Gogh's paintings were unlike anything that had come before. Van Gogh painted light, color, and form as he felt them, the natural world interpreted through his temperament, as he explained. In Starry Night, the visible brushstrokes become a pattern of concentric strokes that transform the sky into swirling, fiery displays. The points of complementary hues become high-keyed, intense colors, divorced from the colors of nature. The moon too yellow, the stars too white, and the vastness of space, just thick slashes of blue, black, yellow, and even orange. When we look at Starry Night, we do not see what Van Gogh saw. We see what he felt. Van Gogh severed his paintings from the need for naturalism, and even from the themes he depicted. His paintings were about him painting. A favorite subject of Cézanne during his last years was the mountain near his home. Although he made 75 painted or drawn versions of the scene, each composition is simple and repetitive, an area of landscape topped by an irregular pyramid of the mountain. With each version, however, Cézanne abstracted the scene farther from the optical experience of the mountain. Using hundreds of small, vivid patches of color, each patch is composed of the precise parallel strokes that Cézanne used to register what he calls his little sensations before nature. The impressions that colors shimmering in the hot southern sun made on his eyes. In the center, the red tile roofs and the yellow walls of the farmhouses are like ready-made color patches. To the left and the right, green and brown represents trees. In the back, blue, white, and black become the mountain, while the sky is green and blue. There are few lines, and none of the color is modeled to suggest three-dimensionality. The paint is flat on the canvas. Through a series of paintings, Cézanne undid the rules of academic painting. The patches of color take on their own independent logic apart from the subject, fracturing what we see into facets. The next generation of painters would study these devices and build on them. Post-Impressionism and Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau depicts nature using elongated, organic forms and erase the distinctions between high art and craft. Design also made a break with the past as the 19th century drew to a close in Europe and the Americas. A new style, Art Nouveau, rejected academic taste and the classical past that embraced nature, especially exotic plants and animals. Sinuous and organic lines meandered across the works of illustrations, furnishings, and fashion. At the time, the influence of Japanese prints led to graphic designs like Henri Toulouse-Lautrec's poster, as we see here, with asymmetry, distinct contour lines, and abstracted spaces, as well as flowing and plant-like forms. Example 2, an illustration by Audrey Beardsley entitled The Climax. Like the artists of the arts and crafts movement, Art Nouveau designers erased the distinctions between high art and craft, between art and design. They created the objects used in daily life in the same formal language as architecture, such as interior design and architecture of Victor Horta's Hotel Tassel. Horta was an early proponent of Art Nouveau, working in Brussels, Belgium. He took advantage of the flexibility of iron in his designs. Iron's strength and elasticity allow for the stairway at the hotel tassel to climb like a vine, wrapping around itself and requiring little support. The railing's decorative tendrils are repeated in the mural painting and in the tile floor. The post that supports the stair ends at the top with branches, and the chandelier's lights look like flowers. Bridging the Atlantic. American and European artists crossed the Atlantic to share ideas and learn new techniques. Europe remained an artistic touchstone during the 19th century in the Western Hemisphere. North and South American artists often went to Europe for part of their training, not only to study with European teachers, but also to see firsthand museum collections and architectural sites, such as the ruins of ancient Rome and the Gothic cathedrals. Some artists, like Mary Cassatt, remained in Europe and spent their careers there. Similarly, some European artists immigrated to the United States or Latin America for new opportunities. Bridging the Atlantic. Romanticism in the Americas celebrated the landscape of newly independent nations. Romanticism was a many-sided movement, and in the Americas it expressed itself most clearly through an attitude towards landscape, an almost mystical reverence for the natural beauty of the unspoiled land itself. Thomas Cole's The Oxbow displays this aspect of American Romanticism. Cole was an English immigrant. Here he depicts the great looping bend of Oxbow of the Connecticut River as seen from above. To the left, a violent thunderstorm darkens the sky as it passes over the mountain wilderness. To the right, emerging sunlight after the storm reveals a valley. Fields have been cleared for grazing and crops. Minute plumes of smoke mark scattered farmhouses, and a few boats dot the river. Cole even gave us a role to play. We have accompanied him on this painting expedition and climbed up a little higher for an even better view. Just below us, we see the artist's umbrella and knapsack, and Cole himself, who stops painting to look up at us. While Cole's vision of Romanticism celebrates the vast potential of the United States and its lands, José María Velasco linked the beauty of Mexico to the indigenous peoples who occupied it. His Valley of Mexico from the Santa Isabella mountain range offers a sweeping panorama of the site where the Aztec capital stood before it fell to Spain in the 16th century. The effects of colonization remain visible, with the church dedicated to the miraculous image of the Virgin of Guadalupe just visible in the center of the painting. Other evidence of the past in Velasco's painting include the volcanoes in the background, which are still known by their Aztec names. The women and children walking in the foreground wear clothes that identify them as indigenous people. They offer a picture of family life as they gather firewood accompanied by frolicking dogs. Yet Velasco's romantic vision of Central Mexican indigenous culture should not be taken at face value. The legacy of colonialism led to persistent discrimination and hardship for the living descendants of the Aztec. Bridging the Atlantic. Realism in the United States included genre scenes. Example 1. Henry Oswald Tanner, The Banjo Lesson, 1893, oil on canvas. The movement known as realism also found its way across the Atlantic. American artists began exploring genre themes in the 1830s, picturing the lives of the lower and middle classes as well as those who had succeeded by their own efforts. These images promoted American values and taught moral lessons about the virtues of hard work, independence, and democracy. Realist artists in the United States included Thomas Ekin, who studied in Paris and toured Europe. Working in Philadelphia, he dedicated himself to painting American lives and to teaching students, including Henry Oswald Tanner, whose banjo lesson is illustrated in Chapter 5. Like many of Ekin's paintings, the Gross Clinic is both a portrait and a scene of everyday life. It pictures Dr. Samuel Gross lecturing to medical students while performing surgery at Philadelphia's Jefferson Medical College. He holds a bloody scalpel, and his assistants and the anesthesiast attend to the patient on the table. Ekin had studied anatomy as a young man and even observed dissections in Paris. The patient's mother recoils at the sight, her emotion a stark contrast to the other onlookers' impassivity. With the light falling on his head and hand, Gross appears almost divine in the composition, a figure of modern medicine and scientific objectivity. Made for an exhibition commemorating the nation's centennial in 1876, the painting celebrated ingenuity and progress in the United States. Like Cole, Aitken included himself in the painting, sketching in the shadows in the gallery. Aitken's realism, however, proved too much for the exhibition's jury, which rejected the painting. Bridging the Atlantic, popular art portrayed the concerns, interests, and values of common people. Posada was a printmaker who created illustrations for the popular press, from religious images to caricatures. Today he is best known for the skeletons or calaveras he made to commemorate Mexican culture. Posada adopted these figures from the imagery of the Mexican Day of the Dead, which honors the deceased, bringing them to life in images more humorous than fearsome. In Skeletons as Artisans, Posada depicts calaveras hard at work, making clothing, painting signs, and doing carpentry. The relief print satirizes the drudgery of everyday lives, reminding us that life is short. Although Posada was skilled in drawing, he uses an intentionally unrefined style in Skeletons as Artisans, with figures roughly drawn in flat space. In other prints, Posada used skeletons to poke fun at political figures, the elite, and icons of Mexican society, all to the delight of his popular audience. Into the 20th century, avant-garde art movements advanced the progress of art against the resistance of conservative forces seeking newness and change. Into the 20th century, Fauvism used color as a fully independent expressive element. The artist who emerged as the leader of this wild new trend in painting was Henri Matisse. The work that alarmed the critics was Woman with a Hat, a portrait of Matisse's wife. In this portrait, the artist freed color from its supporting role in describing the forms as we see them in nature. Madame Matisse's head is not painted in flesh tones that we would expect, with changes in value to suggest roundness. Instead, Matisse built her likeness using thick strips of green and violet on the face and orange to model the neck, repeating the same colors in flat patches surrounding the figure. Matisse departed wildly from nature, making color a fully independent and expressive element in his art. Into the 20th century, Expressionism valued the artist's subjective feelings over objective observation. One important expressionist group is Die Burg, or The Bridge, founded in Dresden in 1905, the same year as the Fauve exhibition in Paris. The bridge the artist had in mind was one to a better and more enlightened future. One of the founders was Erich Heckel, whose work we see here. The intense, unnatural colors show Expressionism's link with Fauvism. The drawing style is harsh and angular. The space is tilted and the figure is distorted. Heckel's model is disturbingly young. Her mask-like face displays no emotion as she lies displayed for our gaze. Like that of other expressionists, Heckel's handling of form and subject is evocative and creates feelings of melancholy and angst. Another expressionist group was Die Blaue Reiter, or the Blue Rider, organized in 1911 by Russian painter Vasil Kandinsky. Kandinsky had been teaching law in Moscow when an exhibition of impressionist paintings so moved him that he abandoned his career and moved to Germany to study art. His early paintings were intensely colored, Fauve-like works on Russian mystical themes. He never abandoned his idea that spirituality and art were linked, but he became increasingly convinced that art's spiritual and communicative power lie in its own language of line, shape, and color. He was one of the first painters to take the decisive step of eliminating representation altogether in such works as improvisation. In his own telling, Kandinsky discovered the power of non-representational art when he was struck by the beauty of a painting he didn't recognize in his studio. It turned out to be one of his own works, set the wrong way up. He realized then that the subject matter was only incidental to art's impact. Color and line mattered more. About color, Kandinsky wrote, generally speaking, color influences the soul. Color is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, the soul is the piano with the many strings. The artist is the hand that plays, touching one key or another purposely to cause vibrations in the soul. Into the 20th century, Cubism broke three-dimensional form into flat planes and rearranging them on the canvas. While artists associated with Europe's many expressionist tendencies were exploring the possibilities of color, two artists in Paris were reducing the role of color to a minimum to concentrate on the problem of representing form and space. One of them was a young Spanish painter named Pablo Picasso. Picasso's partner in this venture was the artist Georges Braque. Braque was older than Picasso in years, but younger as an artist. Picasso, after all, had been an artist since his early teens. Braque was less precocious, but because of that, more disciplined and determined. He developed an intense personal identification with Cézanne, who also progressed from awkward beginnings to mastery. Picasso grew to share this interest, and for a time he renounced his natural gifts to pursue together with Braque this new line of investigation. Picasso and Braque began working together in 1909, and by 1910 their experiments were so closely intertwined that their styles became virtually identical. For a time they even ceased signing their works. In quotes, "We were so prepared to efface our personalities in order to find originality," Braque later recalled. Into the 20th century, Futurism rejected traditional art themes and celebrated the beauty of machines and speed. Bocconi creates the illusion of a figure's interaction with its surroundings by distorting the body, much as our view of a car or a train is distorted as it speeds by. Wind seems to pull at the figure, light seems to reflect off of it, energy seems to emerge from it. It's not difficult to imagine this body to be a machine in motion. For Bocconi and for the Futurists, this machine was more beautiful than any work from the history of art. World War I and after. Dada and Surrealist artists reacted to the horror of modern warfare in World War I. World War I and after. Dada was a diverse movement that overturned the rules and traditions of art, challenging the definition of art, artist, and creativity. In 1916, a group of artists waiting out the war in Zurich, in neutral Switzerland, band together as a protest art movement called Dada. What did Dada protest? Everything. Dada was anti-art, anti-middle-class society, anti-politicians, anti-good manners, anti-business as usual, anti-all that had brought about the war. In that sense, Dada was a big no. But Dada was also a big yes. Yes to creativity, to life, to silliness, to spontaneity. Dada was proactive and absurd. Above all, it refused to make sense or to be pinned down. More an attitude than a coherent movement, Dada embraced as many kinds of art as there were artists. In France, its absurd and philosophical aspects came to the forefront, especially in the work of Marcel Duchamp, whose ready-mades such as Fountain probed the border between art and life. In Germany, Dada developed a biting political and satirical edge in Hannah Höchst's photo collages. Raoul Hansmann's assembled found objects in the spirit of our time mechanical head. To a wooden mannequin head, Hansmann attached dials, a measuring tape, a number tag, a type of cylinder, a yardstick, parts of a watch, and, at the top, a small cup. He drove a nail into one side and a screw into the other. Like Fountain, these seemingly arbitrary additions to a found object called into question the nature of art, asking the question, is this art? And of artist, who is the maker? More importantly, they commented on technology and its potential to alter the human body and mind, a particularly powerful topic immediately followed by World War I. The added parts recall the prosthetic legs, hands, and even noses worn by soldiers wounded in the war. Like other Dada artists, Hausmann used his work to call out the absurdity of technology as a tool to slaughter people. World War I and after, surrealist artists influenced by Sigmund Freud explored dreams, the unconscious, the bizarre, the irrational, the incongruous, and the marvelous. The surrealist painter Max Ernst claimed to have been inspired by a dream when he made two children are threatened by a nightingale. The work is an assemblage of prints, images, paint, and wood elements that the artist constructed. A gate, a house, and a doorknob project from the picture plane, pushing the image into our space. The work depicts a woman running with a knife, another woman lying on the ground, and a man on a rooftop carrying off a child. A tiny bird in the distance hardly seems to pose a threat to the figures at all, as the title suggests. Of course, searching for logic in surrealist art is as difficult as searching for logic in a dream. Ernst stated that this scene played out in his sleep while he was suffering from a fever as a child. Like other surrealists, he believed that his dreams allowed him to get beyond his rational mind and access a superior reality through his unconscious. A distinctive contribution of surrealism to art was the poetic object. Not a sculpture, as it had been traditionally understood, but a thing. Surrealist objects often juxtapose incongruous elements to provoke a shiver of strangeness or a distortion. One of the most famous and unsettling surrealist objects is Marat Oppenheim's object, Luncheon and Fur. Perhaps Oppenheim witnessed two ladies taking tea together in their best fur coats and melted them into a dreamlike object. Perhaps we really are supposed to imagine bringing the furry cup to our lips for lunch. Freud's theories famously claimed a large role for unconscious sexual desire, and surrealist works often have erotic overtones. Possibly the most famous of all surrealist works is Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory, a small painting that many people call simply the Melted Watches. Dali's art, especially here, offers a fascinating paradox. His rendering of forms is precise, we might say super realistic, yet the forms could not possibly be real. The Persistence of Memory shows a bleak, arid, decayed landscape populated by an odd fetal-type creature, some think a representative of the artist, and several limp watches. Time not only stopped, but also is melting away. Perhaps in this work, Dali's fantasy, his dream, is to triumph once and for all over all time. Between the wars, Mexican artists used murals painted in an easy-to-read style to represent Mexico, its history, its people, and its hopes for the future. Before the Mexican Revolution, Rivera had been living in Paris and painting in a Cubist style. On his return to Mexico, he developed a more accessible approach for his murals, and he stayed with it for the rest of his careers. With several large mural projects on Mexican government buildings, Rivera came to represent the Mexican muralist movement, combining history, a celebration of indigenous life, and his own socialist politics. In Mexico, a successful revolution had toppled the old regime. The new government embraced lofty ideals of social and economic reform and concern for ordinary workers, including indigenous peoples who continued to suffer discrimination. In Chapter 7, we looked at a fresco commissioned from José Clemente Orozco by the local government. Orozco was one of several muralists to work for the post-revolutionary government, including Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera was hired to paint at the Rockefeller Center in New York City. Rivera's theme was Man at the Crossroads. His mural promoted a future shaped by modern science and socialism and condemned capitalism and warfare. While Rivera's patron, businessman Nelson Rockefeller, accepted the painter's leftist beliefs, Rivera's inclusion of Russian communist leader Vladimir Lenin in the mural went too far. When Rivera refused to remove Lenin's image, Rockefeller canceled the contract and destroyed the painting. Rivera returned to Mexico, where the post-revolutionary government hired him to create a new version of the mural, now with the title Man, Controller of the Universe. To the right of a worker operating a quote-unquote universe of machinery, scientific specimens, and fertile fields are portraits of Lenin, Karl Marx, Leon Tolstoy, and Friedrich Engels, Riviera's ideological heroes. Between the wars, de Stijl reduced art to essential geometric shapes and primary colors to promote harmony and order across national and ethnic boundaries. One of the most famous artists associated with de Stijl was Mondrian. Beginning as a painter of flowers and landscapes, Mondrian distilled his art to what he considered to be the most universal signs of human order: vertical and horizontal lines, and the primary colors red, yellow, and blue. To him, these formal elements radiated a kind of intellectual beauty that was humanity's greatest achievement. Nature, with its irrationality and irregularity, encouraged humankind's primitive, animalistic instincts, resulting in such disasters as war. In Mondrian's vision of the world, people would be surrounded by the rational beauty of his geometry. Between the wars, the Bauhaus integrated art and design for functionality within a modern, rational aesthetic. Functionalism was also a core principle of the German Bauhaus, a school of design founded in Germany in 1919 by the architect Walter Gropius. The Bauhaus was yet another incarnation of the ideal of collective artistic endeavor in the years following World War I. Roughly translating as building house, the Bauhaus sought to build new guiding principles of design compatible with 20th century technology. Structures, rooms, furniture, and everyday household objects like Marine Bandit's teapot, discussed in Chapter 12, were stripped of superficial embellishment and pared down to clean lines. A poster for an exhibition of Bauhaus art and design by Herbert Bayer shows the school's modern rationalistic aesthetic. 3 geometric shapes and primary colors rest on the picture plane. Arching dashes and solid lines reveal the mathematics that underlie their shapes and positioning on the paper. The typography naming the exhibition and its dates and location lacks serifs and is pared down as geometric shapes. The poster is easy to read and understand, with a modern, mass-produced appearance that seems to visualize the school's motto, art into industry. After the Nazis closed down the Bauhaus in 1933, several of its most important members, including Bayer, immigrated to the United States, and the school's influence continued to be felt in all design disciplines for decades. Between the wars, Harlem Renaissance artists represented the culture of Black Americans with images addressing the rich heritage of Africa, the legacy of slavery in America, and the reality of modern urban life. Much of the spirit embodied in the Harlem Renaissance had to do with the merging of 3 experiences: the rich heritage of Africa, the ugly legacy of slavery in America, ended barely more than 50 years earlier, and the reality of modern urban life. There is no single style associated with artists of the Harlem Renaissance, but the work of the painter and illustrator Aaron Douglas is representative of the spirit and the aspirations of the group. Douglas, who was born in Kansas, moved to Harlem in 1924, during the years of the Harlem Renaissance. He gradually developed a style that he called geometric symbolism. This approach combines the flattened spaces of contemporary modern art with the narrative clarity of the Mexican muralist. Douglas worked proficiently throughout the 1920s, but perhaps most noted for a series of murals he did a few years later for the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. This series is called Aspects of Negro Life. Our illustration shows the segment that Douglas called From Slavery Through Reconstruction. This concludes Chapter 21.